ist zweierlei. Immer noch, auch heute, auch ihr. So the Jew and the nature seem as two different things, always, still, even today, even now. What Paul Celan writes about the Jewish sightlessness or the alienation, non-belonging, or if we might, the Unheimlichkeit, so the non-belonging to the Heimat, is written not without a bitter irony, of course, and yet it reflects not only stereotypes, the Vorurteile about the so-called unnatural, alienated character of European Jews, who, according to the false thesis, were lacking sensual affinity and desire to nature, but rather devoted themselves to scripts, studies, and commercial life. Celan, who himself was a great expert of planets and stones, offers in his own writings, in his poem, but also in his prose, a different, non-fetishist view of being in nature, a view that was free of false romantic interpretations of the landscape, of false view of Heimat. And while visiting Israel, Palestine in October 1969, Celan nevertheless paid attention to what he calls jedes selbst gepflanzte Grün, every planted green that had welcomed him in this land. So Jews and nature thus implies much more than a dichotomy or a binary. It rather offers a perspective on complexive relationship. Jewish traditions attest to many and different interpretations and engagement in the world of nature much before the so-called Zionist revolution. Jews in the diaspora were involved both as individuals and as groups and communities in travels, exploring, studying, praying, reflecting, elaborating their surroundings. Asking about Jews and nature is an invitation to rethink the historical and cultural complexity of the Jewish world. It is, as the lectures in this conference promise indeed, a chance to ask about German Jewish history and culture and to reflect issues such as citizenship, nationalism, gender, belonging, but also solitude and melancholy. But beside the gravitas, so the historical weight and the cultural depth of this question, Jews and nature, it carries with it also potentialities for future thinking and academic engagement. The contemporary climate crisis, the concern regarding our ecological surroundings, but also a reflection of the future of this land, Israel, Palestine, which Jews and Arabs are to share in living. So I thank you very much for attending this evening and the conference as well, and wish you all good luck and joy. Thank you.
A warm welcome from me. I'm Vivian Liska. A warm welcome to all the participants of this conference on nature and Jews, new approaches to German Jews in environmental history on behalf of the cooperation partners in this exciting endeavor. So I'm speaking on behalf of the Institute of Jewish Studies at the University of Antwerp, and I'm very honored that I can address you here. So I want to express my gratitude to the organizers of this conference, in particular its chairman, Professor Galili Shachar, and Dr. Irene Auer-Ben-David and Dr. Sharon Livne for putting together this event around an innovative and cutting-edge topic and for proposing this cooperation. Linking German and Central European Jewish history and Jewish immigration to the land of Israel to environmental history is not merely applying an existing paradigm to the Jewish German-Israeli case. And I was thinking of Galili Shachar's quoting of Paul Celan's Der Jud und die Natur, das sind zwei, and its implication in this constellation of the Central European, the German, and the Jewish, and the land of Israel. And I remember that this quote, Galili, that you quoted here, was on the door at the entrance of an exhibition in Vienna at the Jewish Museum on the Alps, the Jews and the Alps. I think it was called Meine lieben Alpen. And I remember going there and with a friend who said, very outraged, why shouldn't the Jews love the Alps? And why shouldn't they love nature? And my brother, who had just walked in, had heard that and said, well, die gehören ins Kaffeehaus. There you had a Viennese voice of where the Jews belonged. I believe that what we will talk about in these coming days situates the Jews in a more complex relationship to both the Kaffeehaus and nature, and particularly in the case of, and that is why Celan's quote in the German language by a Jewish poet is not arbitrary. This constellation points to a long, rich, and burdened history of diverging concepts and attitudes to nature at all levels, philosophical, religious, social, and historical. So addressing this question from a variety of viewpoints, exploring different historical moments and political implications of this topic promises to yield fascinating insights and vivid discussions. And I wish you all an inspiring conference. Thank you.
Okay, welcome also from my side. I'm really pleased to welcome you all to this conference. I'm not so pleased that I'm not in Jerusalem with you, but I guess that's something that unites all of us. We would prefer to be together in a room and maybe explore nature in the breaks in between. And for example, go to the botanical gardens of Jerusalem and look at the history of the gardens and enjoy the flowers in the same time, which are not blooming yet, I guess, but you know what I mean. So my name is Miriam Rürup. I'm another one of the co-organizers. And this morning I was thinking of how surprising it actually is that Guy Miron, I saw him on the screen somewhere, and me, when we first started talking about this idea about a conference with that topic, we were in Hamburg both. He was visiting. I was still director of the Institute for the History of the German Jews in Hamburg. And we were walking through Hamburg scenery, green scenery along the Alster, which is the tiny lake in Hamburg. And we were actually thinking about what we could do. So why is this surprising? Because it's, I think, 1.5 or 2 years ago. Today, walking is what we do if we meet colleagues, because we have to walk outside because we can't sit in closed rooms. So this conference goes back a while, and I'm really happy that by now we got it together. And I'm very thankful to all the co-organizers, especially the team in Jerusalem. And what we discussed last year, a year ago, Sharon, Irene, Guy, and me, I believe, when we met in Jerusalem, was that we would love to have this conference on Tu B'Shvat, because it has this connection of a Jewish holiday that is not only Jewish, but also has its secular, its Zionist interpretation or reinterpretation. And one can discuss on how a certain attitude of Jews or Judaism to nature can be reflected in this holiday. So that's why we also chose that day, not because we think there is a religious aspect to it, but because we thought a conference or workshop on the relationship of Jews and nature should also discuss religious inclinations. So now, if you look at the program carefully, you'll discover that there's not that much religion in it. So I'm really looking forward on how we are going to discuss this, that we are talking about Jews and nature, but not really talking about the religious aspect about it. What I really like about this conference, and I think it's going to really serve for a few fruitful discussions, is that we are quite an interdisciplinary group. And myself, I now moved to Potsdam where I'm director of the Moses Mendelssohn Center for European Jewish Studies, which in itself is an interdisciplinary research institute that has literary scholars, political scientists, social scientists, and of course historians also, and Jewish studies scholars. So I guess this might also serve for a fruitful conference that we are going to have ahead of us. So thank you all for being here. Enjoy the conference, and I look forward to all your talks from all the participants and to our discussions in the breaks. And now I think Irene is going to add a few organizational remarks that I'm not going to remark about how to deal with the Zoom and a conference online.
Okay, thank you very much, Miriam. And good afternoon to all of you. My name is Irene Auer-Ben-David. I'm the director of the LBI Institute here in Jerusalem. And I'm glad to welcome you also from my side to the opening panel this afternoon. Regarding the technical issues, I just wanted to let you know that we are recording this conference. Afterwards, we will decide which part, if everything or not, will go online. So if you prefer, you should turn off your cameras for the time being. And during the conference, when you're not speaking, I would also like you to turn off your microphones. We also said if you have questions during the conference, it would be best that you write your name down in the chat function, and then the chair of each panel will simply call you, and then you can speak and say your comment or question by yourself. And before starting to delve into our topic and to begin the opening panel, I would also like to use the opportunity to thank Short Way, our cooperation partners who were so open to organize this conference in such uncertain times, rather remote from nature, and framed by the International Holocaust Remembrance Day and Tu B'Shvat, the New Year of the Trees. Also, I would like to thank our speakers for their willingness to join an online conference and to share their research with us in this form. Although it's already for almost a year, I still feel it is new and to be discovered. I would like to thank the colleagues from the Open University, Asaf Shambi and Tali Shaham, who took care of the technical side of the conference, and my dear colleagues at the LBI Jerusalem, Sharon Livnei, Yael Ben-Avi, Noor Dayan, and Bettina Farack, who all helped in different ways to realize this event today. Toda rabba. We called the conference and this panel Approaching German Jewish Environmental History and decided against one keynote. Instead, we would like to open the topic by bringing positions from historians from the different disciplinary backgrounds together in order to open the discussion in this conference. And both Vivian and you, Miriam, you mentioned already, and this is a shortcoming, and there we really need all the other participants in this room. We mainly put together a panel of historians and not so much of people coming from literature, philosophy, or other disciplines. After presenting the participants of this roundtable to you, we will have 2 rounds of statements, and then we will open the discussion afterwards to all of you. So the first person in this roundtable is Dr. Dominik Hüninger from the University of Hamburg. He's interested in 18th century environmental, medical, and natural history, as well as a history of universities. He wrote a PhD thesis on the cultural history of early modern epizootic as a member of the DFG Graduate School Interdisciplinary Environmental History at the University of Göttingen. His current research project is a material history of entomology between 1760 and 1820 as a member of the DFG Center for Advanced Studies, Imaginary of Force at the University of Hamburg. He analyzes the metaphors and narratives of force in the history of natural history, biology in the long 18th century. Dominik joined the DFG Center from the Lichtenberg Kolleg, the Göttingen Institute of Advanced Studies, where he was a managing director since 2012. He's also an affiliate researcher at the Ontarian University of Glasgow and one of the editors of the Brill series Emergence and Natural History. The second speaker in the roundtable will be Professor Miriam Brürup. As she just mentioned, she just took up a new position as the director of the Moses Mendelssohn Center in Potsdam last December. Congratulations. Earlier to that, she was the director of the Institute for the History of German Jews in Hamburg since 2012. Before moving to Hamburg, she worked as a research fellow at the German Historical Institute in Washington, DC. Between 2006 and 2010, she was a postdoctoral fellow assistant professor at the History Department of Göttingen University, working on her still ongoing research project, which is a history of statelessness in Europe after World War I and World War II, and the interaction between the supranational discourse on how to deal with statelessness and the everyday experience of statelessness itself. In 2007, she published her doctorate on the history of German Jewish student fraternities in Imperial and Weimar Germany. Miriam studied history, sociology, and cultural anthropology at the universities of Göttingen, Tel Aviv, and Berlin. Formerly, she worked for the Foundation Topography of Terror in Berlin, the Rosenzweig Center in Jerusalem, and the Simon Dubnow Institute in Leipzig. The next speaker is Guy Miron. He's a professor of modern European Jewish history. His research focuses on German and Central European Jewish history in the 20th century, Hungarian Jewish history, Holocaust studies, Jewish and Israeli historiography. He is teaching at the Open University of Israel, where he has been appointed in 2019 as Vice President for Academic Affairs. Since 2012, he is the director of the Research Center of the Study and Research of the Holocaust in Germany at the International Institute for Holocaust Research in Yad Vashem. Guy Miron is closely connected to the LBI Jerusalem, where he serves today as one of the board members. Among his many publications, I just want to mention three. In 2004, he published German Jews in Israel, Memoirs and Past Images. Last year came out in the journal Zion, a volume dedicated to a Begriffsgeschichte of antisemitism called Antisemitism, Historical Concept, Public Discourse, which he guest edited together with Scott Uri. And we are waiting for his upcoming book that reflects his more recent interests, Space and Time Under Persecution, the German Jewish Experience in the Third Reich. Our fourth panelist is Dr. Netta Cohen. She is a junior research fellow at Christ Church College at the University of Oxford. She has completed her doctoral degree in 2019 at the Center for History of Science, Medicine and Technology at the University of Oxford. Her PhD thesis, which is now being transformed into a book, addresses Jewish climate science in Palestine during the first half of the 20th century. In 2018, she co-founded the Oxford Environmental History Network, which aims to connect researchers working on environmental history at the University of Oxford. Since 2020, she is also a member of the editorial board of the Social History Workshop in the newspaper Haaretz. So my first question to the panelists is, when you're approaching the topic of German Jewish environmental history from each of your backgrounds, what do you think we know already and what has been done so far? Dominic, would you please start?
Yes, thank you, Irene, and also Miriam for asking me to be part of this wonderful initiative and workshop, even though my own knowledge of German Jewish history is very limited indeed. I was, however, very interested in joining when you asked me, because I had thought about the connections between Jewish history and environmental history for a while. And just what I want to do now is to share a few of these thoughts and looking at my own work in environmental history and this of others, to my own kind of field of environmental history, history of science and knowledge in Central and Northern Europe from the 17th to the early 19th century. And for me, I have to say this before I kind of go on, is that humans are an integral part of nature, for better and worse, as we all kind of experience as well. But so any kind of history can potentially be environmental history. And I guess I say this with kind of your support as well, that our main intention was to make visible Jewish Germans and German Jews, or whatever you like to call, as historical actors in environmental history. So, because most often Jewish people have been seen as rather the object of non-Jewish thought in environmental history, or in the history of the relations of humans to nature. And looking back at my own work, especially on the relations of humans to non-human animals, both of these aspects are important in hopefully interesting ways. And I'm just talking for a few minutes on how I encountered Jews in my kind of research. Of course, in European history, reference to Jews and other minorities, for lack of a better term, of course, played an important part in the process of constructing differences, which also included ideologies of difference in nature or of the natural world itself. This is certainly true in the history of epidemics and disasters, where, as you all know, Jews most often feature as scapegoats. And the violent histories of European pogroms since the Middle Ages are tragic examples of these histories. As far as I'm aware, there has been not much or any environmental history yet of how Jews themselves experienced these dual catastrophes of natural disasters and violent anti-Semitism from the environmental history perspective. And let me now just give a few examples of how my former and current research kind of could engage or like encountered agency as well as objectification in relation to German Jewish history. So as Irene said, that my PhD was on cattle epidemics, so epizootics is the kind of technical term for that, cattle plague in northern Germany. And I encountered in my work an actual Jewish person, as well as the anti-Semitic trope of Christian disaster response. So the Jewish butcher, Abraham Rubin from Altona, was as affected by the disease containment measures as his Gentile colleagues, but probably faced anti-Semitic abuse as well. Abuse like the one uttered by the famous Danish Enlightenment poet Ludwig Holberg, who also wrote an essay on the cattle plague. And in his essay, he repeats the well-known trope that I kind of quote here a little bit, that the God-abiding widow, of course Christian, lost everything, but the quote, ruthless grain Jew did well during the pandemic. This and other related violent stereotypes of dehumanizing Jews has also been described in the history of other kind of natural encounters, and especially Sarah Janssen's, I think, well-known history of the Begriffsgeschichte of the term Schädling or vermin in relation to German Jewish history. The issue of naturalization of humans or historicizing nature, if you want, is also a feature of my current research on the history of natural history in 1800s, what we now would call biology. And as Ofri Ilani knows much better than I, Palestine or the Holy Land or Israel was a region of much interest in 18th century Germany, especially the nature of that territory. Many Lutheran theologians tried to reconstruct the environment of the Bible or scripture in their efforts to establish historically correct translations of scripture. Here, Jewish informers and knowledge makers, either in the German territories or in the Near East, were important informers and knowledge makers who played a major role in understanding the supposed natural world of the Bible. And this is something that needs to be explored a little bit more. This interest, of course, continued well into the 20th century, though the history of the natural world of the Near East, well into the 20th century. And German-Israeli biologists like Shimon Bodenheimer, who I'm interested in at the moment as a historian of insect studies, was part of a group of German immigrant scientists interested in the nature of Palestine, and a topic we will encounter tomorrow. But also 18th century natural history was important for the Enlightenment construction of race. And Jews and the history of Jewish life in Europe played an important role, and it is something that we will hear from Karl Niekerk, I guess, later today. One of the kind of Jewish knowledge makers that was important is Markus Bloch, and we will hear a little bit about him by Didi van Trijp, and I'm looking forward to her paper, so I'm not talking about this now. And a very short, kind of to finish my few thoughts here, a very short look to the 19th century that will be talked about by my colleagues later, is I had a bit of a look in the work on the rise of biology in Germany in the early 19th century, and looked at studies by Denise Phillips on the civic natural history groups, or Lynn Neihart on the rise of modern biology. And it was interesting that Jews didn't really feature there. Some of them mentioned, I mean, Denise Phillips mentioned Markus Bloch as part of the Berlin Civic Natural History Society. Lynn Neihart talks about how there were Jewish financiers of the Frankfurt Zoo. But that's it. So it would be really interesting to have a closer look into these stories as well. And I look forward to hear more in the upcoming days on the relations of Jewish Germans, or German Jews, in their specific or varied environments, be they rural or urban, or even maybe maritime. It's something that also needs more exploration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dominic. So we're jumping into 19th century, and Miriam, what's your take on that?
Yeah, thank you, Irene. And first of all, a preliminary remark. While Dominic is, let's put it like this, at least an environmental historian, I'm a historian of German Jewish history, but I never worked on environmental history, nor did I pay any attention to nature so far. So at the beginning, I thought, why should I sit on this roundtable? But then we decided, or it was decided, that it would be interesting to really discuss on how can you do German Jewish history without looking at nature? And is it actually true that one ignores nature or the environmental approach in the broader sense? So I kind of tried to go back to my former research and to think about where does nature cross my or our path of German Jewish historiography. And when I go back to my research, my more narrow research in the German Jewish history, I worked on Jewish student fraternities, which is a very male, exclusively male, very bourgeois, very middle class, very urban group. And this is actually the core of why German Jewish history so far has not really worked together, exchanged ideas with environmental history, and has kind of kept itself outside of environmental history, is what I would say. Let's see what Netta, who is much deeper into environmental history as Jewish history, is gonna say to that. But I think part of it is because German Jewish history, at least, is focusing very much on the bourgeois and the urban groups that the German minority of Jews just was, and that is part of the answer of how nature could be left out. But on the other hand, if we look closer, nature of course comes into the perspective, and I would suggest, I think it's three aspects that I figured. One was something that Dominic already mentioned, which is, of course, nature comes in whenever we look at anti-Semitic tropes of Jewry. In the pejorative sense, nature comes in when Jews are called as parasites or described as parasites. Even when Jews are described as being alienated from the soil, alienated from nature, nature is there, and we just have to look at closer what image of nature is it that those anti-Semitic tropes reproduce or use for Jews. So describing Jews as alienated from nature is always combined also with the prejudice that Jews don't have any connection to the land, are not even capable of working the soil, are rootless, and Luftmenschen, which is another one of those tropes that I'm sure you're very familiar with. So the idea of the people of the book being not rooted in the soil is part of this external view on Jews that brings in nature as a perspective, but we so far don't really talk about it. Why why those pictures or perspectives from nature are being used and which ones are being used. Another aspect that nature does come into German Jewish historiography and also into my own is when we look at the movement at the end of the 19th century, turn of the century to the 20th century, the youth movement and the back to nature, zurück zur Natur movement. And this is, of course, again, the flip side of the very urban characteristics of the Jewish minority in Germany, if not even in all of Western Europe, at least, and then partially also of Eastern Europe. So this idea of going back to the nature, reconnecting with the land, with the nature, is something which is then all of a sudden a very bourgeois trope and develops within German Jewry as part of their bourgeois self-understanding. But it's not the same concept that the anti-Semites use when they say Jews are not connected to the land, because it's not necessarily at that point connected to agricultural work. It's hiking in the lands, it's the Alps, it's the youth movement going outside of around Berlin, for example, or other metropolitan areas and enjoying nature, walking in the nature. This, again, is not an invention by the late 19th century, but even the Maskilim, and we are going to talk about this in just a few minutes almost, or in an hour or so, even the Maskilim had this idea of let's go and enjoy the nature, and we're going to hear about this. So, but this approach to nature was something that is more of an enjoying of nature and not working with and within nature or in agriculture. But then in the 20th century, we encounter, of course, as an addition, so to speak, to the youth movement, the Zionist perspective of the youth movement. And with the Zionist perspective, we have a new approach to nature. And now it's really very much also working the land, not only reconnecting to the land or to nature, but working it. In order to become a Zionist and a pioneer, the work with your hands, the physical work with the land becomes a new endeavor, so to speak. So I'm sure this is something that many of our papers are gonna address. Philip is gonna address it when he speaks about the occupational change, and many speak about Hachsharot also. Just to mention one very new book that I'm glad to see Knut Bergbauer here. They just published a wonderful book on Hachsharot. In Germany, there is still a lot more to do research on, because while I'm speaking about the urban profile of the German Jewish minority, we can still see that some of those supposedly urban Jews really become very rural once they get the feeling for how it is to live outside of cities. And the third aspect that I do come across nature, even in my own work, is of course the image of nature. And this is just something we have to become aware of, and then we'll find probably many more trajectories of environmental history that can be useful if we look into our own historiography or writing and scholarship. So the image of nature is, I mentioned already, the Zionist pioneer, the strong, healthy Jewish body, as opposed to the bookish, reading intellectual Jew. I guess you're all familiar with this imagery, especially those living in the land of our pioneers. And of course, on the other hand, we have the bourgeois image of nature, which is a very, not necessarily Jewish one, but mainly a bourgeois one, which is you have nice pictures, oil paintings of trees, forests, or the Alps in your living room, and you might go outside hiking, but your approach to nature is not working with the soil, but maybe concentrating, for example, as we are going to hear in the talk about Alem or about Chaim Latte, is landscaping. So it's not agriculture as in the Zionist approach, but it's landscaping and gardening, which is a different facet. So overall, I'd say we're probably going to discuss a lot of questions that are not necessarily about the role of Judaism as a religion, as I said in my greeting, but is more about how, is there anything Jewish to the history of nature, or the other way around, is there anything specifically from environmental history that is specifically important if we look at Jewish history? And I'm really not so sure what we are going to find out, because from my remarks, you already take it, I guess, that I think it's more of a bourgeois approach and not so much a specifically Jewish. But this is open to discussion, and I'm really looking forward to how we're going to discuss this. Okay, I should stop here, I guess, and we still have a second round.
Thank you very much, Miriam. So now we're starting a bit to leave European positions on this behind us. Guy Miron is continuing. Guy, you want to start?
Yeah. I'll start with Europe and then a little about Palestine and Zionism. As Miriam said, I'm also quite a newcomer for environmental history. I was exposed to this very interesting discipline a few years ago. It was a little integrated in my project about time and space, but there's much more to be done. And I was very happy to get to know in the last couple of years that there's a new generation of historians working on it and beginning to combine between the two perspectives. Generally, new modes and new methodologies are coming to Jewish history in a short delay. It might take a few years, maybe a decade or even two, until culture history, and it was also with gender history and other aspects. And I think this is also the case in environmental history, and it's beginning to happen now. Joining to what Miriam said, I think there is a more specific element in this delay in our context, and this has to do with the question of Jews, diaspora or galut, whatever you call it, and soil and space. The European Jewish history is considered to be the history which is not happening in the Jewish homeland, and this is why land and soil are supposedly less relevant. In fact, the process of emancipation led to the integration of Jews in the German states, in the German society, but one might say not so much in the German soil, because this happened during the Industrial Revolution and Jews became part of the bourgeoisie. But another way to put it is simply that historians until now did not deal with the history of emancipation from the environmental perspective, and there might be much more to be done also in the context of bourgeoisie. Thus, for example, when Stephen Lewinstein and others dealt with the Jewish residential patterns in Germany, they dealt with the relationship between Jews and non-Jewish social environment, which means dealing with social history, a little cultural history, but not with environmental history, not with the natural environment. This is also the case in the wonderful project of Jewish daily life in Germany, which dealt a lot with what we call Jewish ecology, but not really with nature, with environmental history as we understand it today. The topic of Jews and space is beginning to be approached in the history of German Jews in the third millennium, especially in the last couple of years. Many of you know the projects of Jewish topographies, 2008, Jews and non-Jewish spaces in urban context, 2015, space and speciality in modern German Jewish history. Miriam was one of the co-editors, 2017, but also most of these projects are dealing with space, but not so much with the perspective of environmental history, mostly with urban history, mostly with a more abstract concept of space, but the integration of environmental history in the new perspective is still has to be done. When you look at Zionist historiography, and for this you have to read it also in the Hebrew literature, of course, there is naturally a more tendency to deal with the environment. This has to do with a very simple connection to the land. Zionism has to do with the coming back to the Jewish land, to the Jewish homeland. This has to do with soil, with agriculture, with the physical work. So there is more historiography about it. Still, I would say that the very vast majority of Zionist or history of Zionism historiography about nature can be labeled as old environmental history, which means has to do mostly with the idea of nation state and with the Jewish national parallel Hebrew terms for this like, you know, Yediat Haaretz, Land in the or Heimat Studien, whatever you can translate it, and not to the more up-to-date new environmental history, which is more analytic, more critical, more comparative, more theoretical. This is only just beginning to be approached now by the younger scholars generation, and this has to do a more transnational perspective. Projects like the forthcoming or already published, I'm not sure, book of Tamar Novick, Milk and Honey, Technologies of Plenty in the Making of a Holy Land, one of the first projects of environmental history that I was exposed to, and also Netta Cohen's project, we'll hear about it maybe a little now, are only the beginning of this new environmental history in the Zionist context. Personally, what I did, and I will speak about it much more tomorrow, is dealing with the history of German Jews during the Nazi period and then with their immigration to Palestine, Eretz Israel. And in these two contexts, I see a lot of potential to combine the environmental history perspective between the two sub-disciplines. Until now, it happened only in passing, which means there are a lot of sources, insights that can be related to it are combined in research, but not a systematic project. The topic of Haksharot, of training agriculture, is very important, of course, but I think that it's important to think also about other Jews, more bourgeois, older generation, men and women, how they experienced the exclusion from German nature and environment and came to terms with it. And this is very, very dominant in the sources, and I saw it in my work. Concepts like spatial identity or place identity, which can be taken for different sub-disciplines in social sciences, like environmental psychology or human geography, can be also integrated in this discourse. Diarists and other writers tend to get hold of the German nature and the landscape and nature as a kind of a reaction to the exclusion from German society. But on the other hand, you can find also very interesting voices about the beginning of Jews being alienated from German nature as part of the alienation from the German society. The immigration of Jews from Germany and from Central Europe to Palestine, Israel can also be examined from this new perspective. Until now, most of the literature dealt with the questions of politics, of identity, of economy, of society, like what was done with emancipation. But if we deal specifically with German Jews' absorption in the Israeli or the Yishuv society, there's very, very few systematic projects. One can discuss the professional elites and the way they were encountering the situation in Palestine. This, I think, is part of Netta's project, so I will not get more into it. One can also deal with institutional history. For example, the history of the Israeli Ha'chevra L'Haganat HaTeva, Society for the Protection of Nature in Israel, can and should be elaborated in the perspective of the German Jewish background and with the German society, the German Naturschutz tradition. This is an interesting question that was not discussed yet. I think this will be enough for this round. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You mapped out already a lot of topics. Netta is actually the one. Where are you? Here. Who maybe, as you said, Guy, is one of the scholars of the younger generation who actually tries to bring certain things already together. So Netta, I'm curious to hear what you're saying.
Thank you, Irene. So as expected, I will talk about the new critical environmental history as Professor Meron has described it. And as Meron has pointed out very rightly, this new approach to environmental history, it's not so new anymore, but it is new in Jewish studies. It is very much associated with global history, with transnational history, and with colonial history. This trend actually began in the international academic arena, let's say in the mid-1990s, following the publication of a very seminal book entitled Green Imperialism, written by historian Richard Grove, which you might have heard of. And Grove and his followers defined a few important arguments for this new critical approach. One of the most important of them was the very notion that environmentalism began when Europeans encountered new and unfamiliar environments in the so-called New World. And in this context, Grove claims that after exploiting and destroying to some extent non-European environments, Europeans actually developed notions of conservationism and nature protection, while often still blaming indigenous people for not taking good enough care of their own nature. Now, as a result of this dynamic, this type of literature paid special attention to, first of all, the way in which Europeans imagined the new environments that they encountered. And second of all, their reaction to nature when this environment did not fit the imagination that they had towards it. And this reaction often manifested itself in feelings of anxiety and fear. Now, following these principles, which I'm sure can sound familiar to some of you in different contexts, I think it would not be radical or extreme to say that the Zionist organization, Zionist movement, often emulated these type of colonial approaches to the environment in Palestine. Because as we know, when arriving in Palestine, Zionists, first of all, blamed the local Arabs and the Ottoman authorities for destroying nature or for not maintaining it as they should have. Second of all, they very often projected strong imaginations towards this environment, which were usually associated with the biblical legacy of this country. And last but not least, after arriving in the country, Zionists often expressed feelings of anxiety and fear towards the local environment itself, rejecting usually its climate and its semi-arid characteristics. But I would like to argue that Zionists did not only think about the environment in Palestine like other Europeans did in the colonies, but also they also proactively absorbed European colonial strategies towards the environment. And in this context, we can speak about the Zionist absorption of British colonial approaches during the Mandate period, such as afforestation. David Scholl can speak about this more broadly, of course, irrigation and other strategies to fight and change, manipulate the environment. Starting from the 1930s and 40s, we can also speak about a very interesting absorption of knowledge produced in former settler colonies, such as Australia and South Africa, which I discuss in my own work. But Zionists also were also influenced by German colonial approaches to non-European environments. And I just picked up a few examples for how this is manifested, or where we can see these manifestations. So I think one of the most interesting examples is actually the personal biographies of some Zionist natural scientists, such as the botanist and Zionist leader Otto Warburg, Zelig Soskin, and others, who in their own biographies, they capture this transition between different colonial enterprises. And by that, I mean that they did not only study in German universities and imbibe colonial approaches that were prevalent in the curriculum of the natural sciences of the time, but they also gained their professional experience within the German colonies themselves, where they served as experts before joining the Zionist movement. So this is one example. Then you have, due to the lack or the short number of Jewish scientists that were working on natural issues, the Zionist organization actually very often hired non-Jewish experts to investigate the natural conditions in Palestine and in other destinations which were considered for Jewish colonization. And these experts, they were often German. So this fact has obvious consequences on the strategies and the methodologies or ways of operations and the conclusions of these experts, which obviously also had their impact on decision-making within the Zionist organization and decision-making towards the territory, I mean. A third example is the cooperation of the Zionist organization with German colonial associations that were active in Palestine before World War I, such as the Deutsches Palästina-Verein, which was kind of an equivalent to the very well-known British Palestine Exploration Fund. So you have, I cannot go too deep into the layers and the meanings of this type of manifestation of colonial approach to this environment in the German context, but you do have these examples, and I do think that they are significant in this landscape. So yeah, I hope I was able to elucidate a bit about the meaning of critical environmental history, at least in the Zionist context. And I'm very much looking forward to hear the paper in the coming days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Netta. So the four of you really raised already a lot of topics and different levels and perspectives on how to relate to nature and environment. Looking at my watch, we have 5 minutes left until the break. So this will not give us time for a really second round. So I think the best would be really to invite questions or comments now. And so my second question actually would have been, where would you see the potential of such a new critical German Jewish environmental history from your backgrounds? And are there comments from the audience too? Okay, so if not, maybe the panelists, maybe Dominic and Miriam, you want to relate to this too?
I could say something to what Netta just ended with maybe, because actually this is one of the problems of Zoom meetings. I find that you raise a question and you don't really know whether people are still thinking or just don't have questions. It's because you just don't see the faces. So in case someone does have a question, please enter it in the chat and we'll not continue just talking. Okay, so what you mentioned about the experts, that they learned, so to speak, in other settings, is actually something that is really fruitful to Jewish history in general, because not only is Jewish history sometimes late to to new developments in historiography. I mean, we saw it with gender history. I think it arrived in Jewish history some 10 to 20 years later. So now environmental history is also a bit later here. Let's see about the human-animal turn, when it's going to come. It might come in the same time. But also, the chances that Irene just asked for could be that if we introduce environmental history, we also broaden the perspective, our perspectives on Jewish history, because we always have to look at also the non-Jewish history. Because if we look at the botanists or zoologists or insect researchers, whatever, they were always active in a mostly probably non-Jewish environment. But you know what I mean. So those interactions can actually help us leave the narrow confines of Jewish history and to look at Jewish history in a much broader sense.
Yeah, I would just respond on that. A few weeks ago, I was discussing some historiographical issues with a colleague, and we mentioned global history. And global history is often, I mean, it's a very existing field, but some people tend to say, what is it actually? What is global history? It's another form of saying colonial history, imperial history, or I mean, how do we approach this? And I think that Jewish history, in a way, is a global history, is part of a global history, or can be seen through a global history, if we wish. And within this perspective, we have to look at not only interactions of Jews among themselves in different parts of the world, but also their the influences that they received in different places, which are, I don't know about, perhaps they are more prevalent in Jewish history, but in Zionist historiography, at least the things that have been published until recent decades, this type of approach was very, very scarce. So we tend to look at ourselves from within our own views, and we forget how much Jewish history is embedded in so many other contexts. I think for me, coming to study, doing my PhD abroad, and working on environmental history enabled me to see how many other case studies there are of settler societies encountering new environments, unfamiliar environments, and seeing the resemblances between these different case studies, and taking this as kind of a starting point to approach the issue, rather than the other way around, rather from within. Yeah.
If I can add, from my perspective, I mean, what we heard from the two environmental historians among us, Dominique and Netta, from my impression, it's mostly dealing with the way different elite groups reflected and practiced about environment, which might be a key element in the development of the discipline, also in its implementation in Jewish history, in German Jewish history. From my perspective, I want to add to it, and I think also Miriam applied to it, also the integration of wider social groups, not being experts practicing, conceptualizing more systematically, but reflecting about it. And this has to do with our approach to sources, because when you come to a new methodology or to a new perspective, a new subdisciplines, one way to come to terms with it is to look for the new sources which are dealing explicitly with these topics. And this, I think, it's a very important way. What I suggest, and this is this was also what I did with Time and Space, is to go back to the diaries and to the newspapers we were already dealt with while doing social and cultural history, and read them again from the perspective of our new questions. And I'm sure, and from my experience, we find new topics. So this might divide the orientation of environmental history maybe to a few sub-disciplines or few sensibilities. I think this could be interesting.
Okay, thank you all very much. I think that really opened up a lot of issues that we can follow on in the next 2 days. We have now a break, 10 minutes, a Zoom break, however that looks like. I'm sorry that we can't have a coffee on the floor. And at 6 o'clock, Professor Shmuel Feiner will chair and start with the next panel. So see you in a bit.